Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think the Mayor has said everything that needs saying, so it remains for me only to thank you all for coming and bid you a pleasant evening. No, it is wonderful to see so many of you here, despite all these competing events tonight. And it's very flattering for me as a member of the European Parliament to get such a big audience, because, you know, we MEPs are not generally the most popular people in politics. No, don't feel you've got to rush forward and contradict me when I say that. I've become accustomed to this over the years. When I was elected, John mentioned I was elected 10 years ago. I got in on a turnout of 24%. I'm not making this up. More people voted the following day in the eviction round of our version of Big Brother than participated in the election that returned me to the European Parliament. So it's without any sense of false modesty that I stand before you this evening. I must tell you, though, about the one MEP who doesn't have the problem of low name recognition. The one MEP whose name is always remembered wherever he speaks. And that is a Christian Democratic colleague of mine from Luxembourg who glories in the name of Mr. Goebbels. And I will promise you this is a true story. I will never forget the first time that Mr. Goebbels rose to speak in the chamber. The man in the chair that day, the presiding officer, normally a deputy speaker, happened to be a British Labour MEP called David Martin. And when he saw Mr. Goebbels' name on the speaker list, he became visibly agitated. And there was this pure Fawlty Towers moment, because Mr. Goebbels' name was clambering higher and higher up the list, and you could see David Martin saying to himself, "Don't mention the war, don't mention the war." Don't mention the war. And when it finally got to Mr. Goebbels' turn to speak, he was in such a state, he said, "I now call Mr. Goering." No, I mean Dr. Goebbels. I mean Mr. Goebbels. For the rest of us, it's wonderful to be given any kind of platform anywhere, let alone here in the Southwest Pacific. And as Banksy said, I've now been re-elected, which is great. And you will know there is nothing like an election to remind a politician of the wide diversity of wildlife that he represents. I remember I knocked on one door in the Isle of Wight, and it was answered by a farmer. He was very pleased to have come across a Euro candidate. And he told me this involved story about a seed bull that he'd purchased. He'd spent a fortune on this stud, and it wouldn't do the business. He put it with all his heifers. It wouldn't serve any of them. And then he'd found this wonderful drug on the internet. And bingo, the bull couldn't get enough of it. All his heifers were in calf. He was absolutely delighted. And he was very alarmed to hear that the European Union was going to prescribe this chemical. And I said to him, "Well, all right, sir, I'll look into that for you. What's it called?" He said, "Oh, that's it. I can't remember its name, but I can tell you that it tastes of aniseed." And then I knocked on one door in a town called Woking that was answered by a little boy who must have been all of about 6 years old. And he was wearing this great smoking jacket. It was hanging loosely from his shoulders. In one of his little hands, he had this great balloon of brandy. It was about the size of his little head, and he was swirling it slowly around. And in the other, he had what looked like a very expensive Cuban cigar. Well, as you do when you're canvassing, I leaned down and I said, "Are your parents at home?" And he said, "Does it effing look as though my parents are at home?" So I keep on getting these texts. They're very rude, from somebody called Andrew Williams. You probably know who he is, Mr. Mayor. Now, the conventional thing for a British politician in New Zealand would be to begin by saying, here is this great paradox that you cannot be further from the United Kingdom physically and still be on dry land than in this country, and yet you are in a country that is closer to ours than any other on earth. And that's such a truism, and of course it's a truism because it's true. I mean, it may be a cliche, but it doesn't become any less valid for that. But I've been turning over in my mind what I think are the more interesting things, which are the differences. And I don't mean the superficial differences of flora and fauna and so on. I'm thinking about your constitution. Let me pick up from where the mayor left off about the governor arriving in 1840. I think this country was very lucky in the timing of its rise to constitutional independence. The late 19th century was the high point of the Victorian confidence in parliamentary supremacy. and in a strong legislature. And that was unthinkingly reflected. It was taken as for granted by the people who in the late 19th century in New Zealand went from representative to responsible government, vested powers in the legislature, tried to disperse power, tried to constrain the executive. The tragedy of my country, of what the mayor calls the home country, is that we are now losing sight of all of those precepts that would have once been regarded as Britain's greatest invention, our happiest export, our supreme contribution to the contentment of mankind. And so when I come here, I see surviving, rather like those grapes, those vines in California that survived the phylloxera blight in Europe, I see the remnant of what ought to have been the reality of modern Britain, that you've preserved a sense of parliamentary independence and sovereignty that we, alas, are losing. I'm conscious that I'm speaking in the world's first full democracy, the country that had the first adult franchise. And I can't divorce that fact in my mind from the fact that with all of the problems that the mayor outlined, I would gladly swap my problems with yours, financially. I think there is a link between strong institutions of representative government and small government. I would rather vest my confidence in the electorate and their elected representatives than in the standing bureaucracy that comprises the permanent state machine. And the most precious thing that we invented as a country and that you've preserved was this idea that laws should be passed only by elected representatives and that budgets should be set only by responsible legislators. That may sound like the most banal and anodyne observation, but we are losing it in the United Kingdom. When I say, I wish we had your problems, okay, you heard all those scary figures on debt. Let me give you one fact about our level of debt in the United Kingdom. In the last year and the current financial year, in other words, in 2009 and 2010, Gordon Brown will borrow more than every previous government from the institution of the national debt in 1693 to 2008. More in those 2 years than in the whole of the period of our history up until that moment. And it's a similar thing in the United States. Barack Obama is on course to have borrowed more than every president between George Washington and the second George Bush. Let me tell you a little story that seems apposite to our current discontents. The year is 1944. Clement Attlee is Prime Minister. And one day he's relieving himself in the gents at the House of Commons. The door swings open, and it's the leader of the opposition, Sir Winston Churchill. He sees Attlee at the urinal, and he strides purposefully to the farthest end of the room. And Attlee, noticing this, says, "Oh, feeling a bit standoffish today, are we, Winston?" Churchill, majestically unbuttoning his fly, replies, "No, but whenever you see anything big, Clement, you nationalize it." Well, I say apt to our present discontents for this reason. Gordon Brown is on course to borrow more than Winston Churchill borrowed to win the Second World War with, right? With the rather obvious distinction that we're not fighting the Second World War. We are indeed, if anything, busily engaged in handing away the freedoms that our fathers defended on that occasion, mine among them. Above all, our freedom to live under our own laws and our own people, in our own sovereign parliament. And with that money, he is spending a higher percentage of the United Kingdom's wealth on nationalisation than was spent by the Attlee government at the height of the post-war seizures of the big industries. That's the extent to which we are reverting to socialism and poverty and debt. And don't imagine, my friends, that you are completely immune from this. Right? Don't imagine that this is a John Wyndham novel where the whole of the rest of the world has been sort of taken over by some cataclysm, but civilization survives here, because you do get dragged into the institutions of global architecture that are predicated on the idea that international technocracies know best.